I see why some people get addicted to ayahuasca and why they keep going back. It's just because it's like, do you want to paddle across a lake or do you want to get in like a steamboat and just have it take you to the other side? But I do believe that's a shortcut. I don't think you do the hard work because when you come back to reality, you need to be better at this and you need to like keep doing it. So you said it earlier, and I completely agree, but I would not have agreed with you before I did ayahuasca. We are interdimensional beings. We are in an interdimensional something. There are dimensions. And the reason I use that word is because that has to do with Einstein and time and stuff. Like time is definitely not working the way we perceive it here.
Hey everyone, and welcome back to the Shifting Dimensions podcast. I'm your host, Jummie Moses, and thank you again for joining me on the show. I have the pleasure of speaking today with Mike Oppenheim. Mike is the host of the podcast Coffin Talk, and in that podcast, he explores how our views on death affect the way we live our life. And he is also the author of 5 novels. And today, I'm going to be speaking to Mike about his experience with ayahuasca. We're going to talk about life, purpose, and what it means to change ourselves, and a couple other things. So I'm really excited for this conversation, and I'm glad to have Mike on the show. Mike, welcome to Shifting Dimensions.
Hi, and thank you so much for having me on. I'm really excited, and I like our topics that we're going to discuss because it's hard for me to talk about this kind of stuff, and I normally don't want to open up about it, but I also know that it's helpful for people who are interested. So,
Yes, and I've listened to you on a couple of different podcasts, and I've just looked into your work, and I think you have very valuable insight. And I think it's important to level set and start with your experience with ayahuasca, right? Because I think a lot of what you talk about is finding inner peace in a world where there's a lot of chaos. And I think a lot of people take ayahuasca to help with finding that inner peace and getting to know themselves a little bit. So I want to start there with you, if you could talk about your ayahuasca journey and what you learned from that.
sure, there's a little bit of a ramp to the story that I think is important. As a young child, my parents were transcendental meditators, so I wasn't raised with religion, but I was raised by parents who meditate, and they taught me to meditate when I was a little kid, and they were always very honest, not about doing drugs. I want to be like specific, but they were like when we were like adolescents and growing up, we smoked pot and we were hippies and we traveled, and then we found meditation, and meditation is better than drugs. Meditation is better than a lot of things like sugary. They would just compare it to like different highs, and they would say like the greatest high and the one that's the best for you is meditation. So they raised me with the mindset of be healthy and be like mindful, but they also mentioned smoking pot and stuff. So I had this like double-edged personality. I'm also just me, and I grew up in like Berkeley, Oakland, California. So even in the 90s when I was coming of age, marijuana was borderline legal. So early on in life, I experimented with a little bit of pod. And then by the time I got to college, I was trying mushrooms and LSD. And I did not like mushrooms and LSD a lot. I wasn't hugely into them, but I always appreciated the insights I got from them. So it was, again, a double-edged sword. I would come down and I was not like, oh my God, let's get more. Let's gobble these things up and like go watch a film festival. I'm not that kind of person, but I was like, oh, I wrote 500 pages in a journal. I'm going to go home and think about this, turn it into songs. And so but that was a short-lived period of my life. By the time I was like 23, 24, I was pretty much just, I wasn't normal. I was playing in bands and doing that kind of stuff, but I wasn't a huge pothead. I'm not a heavy drinker. I definitely partake in culture and society, but I've always had just, I like sleep and I like health and I like energy. And I've also meditated every day. So with all that said, one day in my early 30s. So I want to say like 2010, 11. I know Obama was president, like life was good. I was like in a very like good place personally. And the reason I say all that is because I remember hearing this thing about ayahuasca a few times, and then it just started becoming like a word I started hearing more. And I've always liked to do things like not in the first wave when like only the insane people are doing it, but also not in the third wave when everyone's doing it. I like to be like in what's called the second wave, which is just what ushers it in. So I was like, all right, I'm going to try to do ayahuasca. Unfortunately, I also had fallen in love and was getting married. So I was like, this is not the best time. And I don't believe in doing something that serious without like the way it's supposed to be done. And I'm going to get into this more too, because I do like to give people my philosophy on if you're going to do ayahuasca, how seriously you should take it. Because I saw people who didn't take it seriously and they did not have a good experience. And I'm going to repeat this later with like more. But for now, I'll just say I knew in the back of my mind, ayahuasca is not something I want to take in someone's apartment building in Oakland or San Francisco. It was like something if I'm going to do this, I'm going to go to a legal place. I want relatives at the very least of indigenous shamans with me. I don't want, with all due respect, I just don't want some American hippie telling me so. And you can do it that way. I have no problem with, like, some people call it appropriation. I don't care. I don't think it is. I think you can move and learn and adopt things and share them. So I'm not like on that angle about it so much as I do think it's a, from everything I'd read before I did it, it's like a very strong experience. It's not a drug. It's not mushrooms or acid. It is unlike anything else I've tried. And I will get into that later. But with all that said, I was intrigued beyond anything. So flash forward to 5 years later, I was going through a divorce, unfortunately, with my wife. And we had a 2 year old, 1.5 year old son at the time, and he was turning two. And so we had agreed on the custody schedule that I would let her go back to Thailand where she was raised. She's an American citizen, but she's also Thai. And so she was born in America. I mentioned this because later on this will matter in a different story. And so I booked a trip to Ecuador where it's not only legal to do ayahuasca, but it was up in like the high mountains with the same weather as like Santa Cruz, California. It like just sounded my kind of style. And Ecuador, just in case anyone's interested, all the reviews I had from Brazil and Peru and Ecuador, those are like the three major places you can legally do ayahuasca. I think Guatemala has it too now. That was the only one that was not only safe, but it had a lot of like the trip advisors and things I was reading, like said, oh, these people aren't ripping you off and stuff. I just read like some really scary stories about specifically Brazil and Peru. Not all of them, but enough that I was like, I'm going to hedge my bets. So I found this retreat in Ecuador. I really vetted it, and I strongly recommend you vet if you're going to go out of country to do something. And I just fell in love with the idea, and I had 2 weeks. I had 2 weeks while my son was going to be in Thailand, and then he was going to come back so with his mom. And so I booked the trip, and I went to there. And then this is where it's interesting. You're supposed to go for 8 days and you're supposed to do it 3 times, like the first night, in the middle, and at the end. But I only had 5 days. It was just like a long story, but getting my kid to the airport, making sure he flew, and just getting other things done. So I decided to do ayahuasca 3 times in 5 days. I decided to fly to Ecuador, do it the very first night I was there, sleep and have a day off, do it the next night, sleep and have a day off, and then do it the last night and then leave the next day. Oh, and I should mention this too. Ayahuasca, unlike, if you've done DMT, if you're listening to this and you've done DMT, is like a 15 to 20 minute part of an ayahuasca 4 to 6 hour arc. It is not the peak, nor is it not the peak. It's just a part, and that's impossible to explain beyond that because unlike mushrooms, acid, marijuana, cocaine, any drug I can think of, it's not like a specific arc that's really reliable or predictable. On top of that, how much you do is going to be different because a shaman or the person in charge is going to be mixing something to make it. And on top of that, as I've discovered from doing it enough 3 times, it is wildly different each time. And I believe part of that is the famous, like, Richard Halpert, Timothy Leary studies on LSD, which is set and setting matters a lot. And so one thing I just heard recently that I will repeat because I think it's very true. Whatever it is that you're worried about thinking about when you're going to do ayahuasca, yes, that's exactly what you're going to think about and run into. So if you have severe trauma in your history, don't do ayahuasca unless you want to confront, face that trauma. And it's not on your terms, and it's not on some Freudian terms, and it's not on some therapist terms. It's this unique relationship between you and something else. There's a million ways to define what's going on, and that would have to do with your philosophy of the ego, the observer. Are you yourself? Are you a spirit? Do you have a higher self? I've heard like 50 million ways to describe it, and I appreciate all of them because I think that you relate your experience to yourself the way you do and I do, and that's just like a part of being a human. I don't think it's possible for all of us to relate it the same way. If it was, I don't think we'd have like elections or countries. I think we'd just be like pretty peaceful people. So the way you digest and think about a situation, I think matters a lot. And so with ayahuasca, so I'll get into the story. So I was like flying there, and before you fly there, if you read about it, they say you need to do the ayahuasca diet. They don't say we suggest you do this. They're very strict too. If you're on MAO inhibitors or like certain drugs, you cannot do it. It would kill you. It could kill you. If you have a heart condition, like there's a lot of like severe warnings, and it's not like American like Apple end user agreement stuff. We're talking like real science backed, like you better know what you're doing. But as long as you're like a healthy, normal person who's specifically not taking certain like meds, they recommend you do it. But they do recommend you follow the ayahuasca diet, which it has been years since I did it. This was 2017 when I did it. I know what I ate going in was only white rice with no seasoning, no oil, just white rice cooked in water. And I ate hard boiled eggs with nothing else on them, and I had raw almonds and I was allowed to have plantains. I did not, only because of like where I lived and stuff. It wasn't like a choice. I'm actually part Cuban and love plantains, so it wasn't anything like that. But I just had like limited resources for it. And also, I was going to be traveling for 18 hours to get there. So I remember packing a Ziploc bag with white rice for the airport because I couldn't put it in Tupperware because of some steamroller. It was weird. And I just had this bag of raw almonds, and I brought two hard-boiled eggs for the first leg of the flight. And I just remember getting to Ecuador starving. So I was on this diet I took it seriously for 2 weeks. The one rule I did break, and I'm just full disclosure for people, I did smoke marijuana all the way up until I left. I didn't smoke while I was there. That was just a personal choice. I've been smoking marijuana at night to fall asleep for years, and I didn't want to lose sleep versus the health. And also, I just thought about it and I was like, I don't think THC is going to interact the way. What I do think it would do is what it does do, which is it just lowers your consciousness overall. And it doesn't, you're not your most vibrant. If you quit smoking pot for 2 weeks, you'll find that you're a little more electric. So it's not, I don't like people who say marijuana doesn't do anything to you. It does. But just like a person who has a nightcap to fall asleep or whatever, I like to smoke a little and I'm happy with that. But I am presenting that to people because I did do that. So I followed the ayahuasca diet to a T with that one exception. When I got to the retreat, there were 30 people there, and one other person had followed the ayahuasca diet and none of the others had. And they had followed their version of it, like some weak version. And I'm just saying this, it's not a bragging right, but it is undeniably true because I've had many other experiences with people, and I was the only person who had a overall great experience. At no point was I sobbing, crying, vomiting hysterically, like any of the things you read about, which nearly every other person was doing. So I want to make this clear that I truly believe, I don't think God was watching over me. I don't think I'm special. I think I just followed some basic rules. I think that this is a very powerful substance. It has to be mixed with a different substance. They have no idea how these shaman cultures discovered it. It's the equivalent of putting an airplane together with like forest parts, but it does work and it is ancient. And a lot of the medicines we use are medicines that we discovered from indigenous cultures. And then in labs, you can replicate and stuff. So there is something deep about this. And I do believe that at the very least, this is something that certain people should have access to and be allowed to do. With that said, I don't think everyone should do it. I don't think everyone needs to do it. And I absolutely never just recommend someone do it. I just answer questions and talk about it. And again, I would really stress that if marijuana makes you nervous, for example, don't do it without expecting to be nervous. Like I'm not saying don't do it, but you know how you are. I have a head and I get anxious, but I also have years of like meditation and strategies for dealing with anxiety. And I used it on every single one of my journeys with ayahuasca. So there were definitely points where an alarming orange heat was like entering. And I remember saying this like really clearly, not out loud verbally, but in my own head. I don't learn lessons through fear. I'm not good at learning this way. Teach me a different way. And it worked. It like switched how it was teaching me. So that would be my strongest recommendation to people is I hear a lot of stories about like, I was a panther or I was in a forest and there were panthers. No matter what, all these stories to me have a theme, which is there was a guide, there was a teacher in it. And in my journeys, all of them, the guide was me. Like I learned a new relationship to myself. And we're going to get into this later in the podcast, but I realized that I have a not unique ability, but I am good at this ability already. And I with ayahuasca, it helped me train it and now I can use it. And again, I think this is not true anymore. They've actually proven this isn't true, but they say we only use 10% of our brain. That's not actually true. We use 80 something percent. The point is we still don't use all of it. And I do believe there are other functions and things that our brain can do. And one of them was something I learned on ayahuasca, which is I do believe that if you can, even with meditation, this happens. If you can not be in your brain so much, there's a different connection to something, and that stream isn't clogged. It's just that you're used to turning on a different faucet and you didn't even realize that there's another one. That's like the best way I could explain it.
I was just gonna say that I really love that you gave that disclaimer about ayahuasca, about one, there needs to be a lot of research that goes into it. And there are precautions that you need to take if you are going to embark on that, because it's a deeply profound and spiritual experience, right? I've heard different people who've had an experience with ayahuasca. Some have come out of it knowing themselves a lot better, and others are still struggling with additional trauma, right? Because I do think that when you are going into such an experience, you are opening yourself somehow to different dimensional entities. I do believe that some good, some bad. So you have to be very careful before entering something like this. And I want to dig a little bit deeper because you said that you decided to go and experience ayahuasca at the time you were going through a divorce with your wife. So was the divorce the catalyst to transmute the pain of what was happening in your life at the time?
Yeah, that's a great question. And it's also like as I get older and more distance from the divorce, it's easier to answer this question because I don't think at the time I was consciously thinking anything that you just asked, but I am certain now that yes, there was like a compelling inner reason to go on this trip, and it was definitely to figure out how I had made such a big mistake. And when I say that, because I love my son and I want him to have like, the best life possible, he's not a mistake, and it wasn't a mistake to try to be married to his mother. The mistake was ignoring many intuitive messages along the way that I could have just avoided a lot of trauma and other things that happened. And so the divorce was not cantankerous. It wasn't, it was just her parents were very sad and disappointed in both of us. And no one was happy because the main reason we were getting divorced is we constantly fought about whether to raise our kid in Thailand or in America or both. And we tried combinations of all three. Like I've lived in Thailand and nothing was working. So it was like this exhausting 7 year experiment in not only being married but then sharing a kid. And so on the terms of the divorce, we had agreed that he would go back to Thailand every once in a while. And I was during the divorce, I kept telling my attorney, I don't trust her and her family. I think they're gonna try to keep him in Thailand when he's there. Can we put assurances in? Can we like build some apparatus to protect that? And she said, yes, you could build that in, but if you approach that, her lawyer has said they will take you to court and they will do everything they can to get full custody. And we had already caught her lying. She had written like emails to several people trying to get them to say false things about me. So I knew that she was not only capable, but like interested in changing the narrative to her benefit only so she could live in Thailand with him. It wasn't because she hated me and had a vendetta against me. It was because, okay, if we're not going to be together, he's mine. And I should dip into this a little bit because I worry if my son gets older and watches this. Thai culture, men just really have no right to a child. It's just not, it's mostly a man's reason. Like it's a patriarchal thing. They're just like, you're a dude. Like you're allowed to have affairs. You're allowed to like work long hours, go out. Like it's a totally different culture. If you're American, I mean, you can move there, study it or whatever, and it's easy. But if you grow up in America, we don't have a model like that. None of even our like mini groups in America don't have it. So they treat children very differently in Thailand, and it's a child first culture. Children can sleep in their parents' bed until they're 10, and then very abruptly, like between 10 and 12, you become an adult and you're no longer treated like a kid. Like it is just the carpet being pulled out and then some. And then it's be quiet, obey your elders, go to school, do what we say. No way you would sleep in a bed with your parents. So that was a lot of our conflict was like specifically, hey, if our kid's growing up in America and kids find out when he's 4 that he's sleeping in a bed with his parents, no. Like I was a dude in this country. I grew up. I don't care how much like diversity and inclusion is going on in schools. Not that much. There's definitely still little kids just make fun of the other kid. It doesn't matter like which other it is and how it changes over time. So I am, and to be fair to my wife, my ex-wife, and to be fair to the universe, I could have pushed less hard. I could have been like a very flexible and different. And this is part of why I appreciate ayahuasca and why I like constantly trying to be open-minded and constantly trying to shift my mindset. And it's why I'm on your podcast, Shifting Dimensions, because I like to tell people when you're going through a divorce, the first step is usually you blame the other person for 90 and you say you're maybe 10%. And then by the time the divorce rolls around, if you're healthy and really thinking, you're like, okay, it's 70 their fault, 30 mine. And then you're over the divorce when you say it's 50-50. Like what? So I will say the following because I'm going to go into the ayahuasca journey and like how that deals with your questions. I would say right now, as far as the marriage to my first wife goes, 100% 50-50, blah, blah, blah. After the divorce, there's no question it's not fair what happened to me and what they did. So I'm just going to throw that out there that like, I don't want people to think I became unreasonably, for lack of a better word, like a hippie. But I still believe that you have rights to things and there's agreements and contracts and you should follow them and that a good, honorable person meets what they said they would do. So, with that said, when I went to Ecuador, I was looking to figure out what's next. And I didn't mean like with another woman or a relationship. Like I wasn't at all close to that point. I didn't want to get a divorce. I didn't want to be a failure in my own words. Like I'd never I have two parents who are still together. So my model for my life was not to pick and choose and experiment and have a lot of partners and stuff. I just wanted to meet the one person when I was 15, have a family with them. I've never been someone who wanted to sow a lot of wild oats. So I went to Ecuador like pretty crushed. And then I remember on the trip I was very vulnerable. It had been like a long time since I'd been alone in a setting with 28 other people. And it was totally diverse ages and groups, people from all over the world. And they had all been together for 6 days before I showed up. My mindset was definitely, how can I grow up and what is next and what can I do? I have been, and I'm going to continue to be a single dad. We had exactly 50-50 custody, which is the best I could hope for. I didn't want more than half because I didn't want to take her son from her as much as I also wanted my fair share. But it was exhausting. Trading off a kid is like a horrible feeling. It's the worst feeling in the world. Like getting a divorce is the second worst feeling. Getting a divorce with a kid is like so much worse. And like for like kids of divorces now, like when I meet people, I get it on like a whole different level and I see what we did to you. And I get it's just hard. And so many arguments were designed to not affect the kid, including the ultimate argument, which is a therapist told us like, you should get a divorce. Like your son will be better off not watching you guys interact the way you do. To answer your question, like in a roundabout way, I think I was really just looking for the universe to give me advice. It just gave me such a simple and clear message, which is the more you relax and don't try to control anything, the more awesome and in control you will feel and the better life will get. And that is a hard lesson to practice. It's really easy to hear that and be like, yeah, of course. But flow state is a thing. And it's not just when you're into like a project. You can have a flow state in a conversation, in a lecture, in a movie. There's just like this constant stream of intuitive energy running in you and through you and to you. And so yeah, so I think that's what I would get into next if you want me to talk about the actual ayahuasca.
Yes, I would love for you to talk about the actual ayahuasca and what that experience was like.
So you get to the place and they do a big ceremony. It's around a fire. They explain the philosophy. And remember, this is an Ecuadorian tradition. So I don't know about Brazil, Peru, or any place else. But what I do remember them talking about a lot is they never once said east and west. They kept saying north and south. And I thought that was mind blowing because all you hear about in America is east and west. They talk about north and south because that's their conflict. And they kept talking about how the south shouldn't hate the north and the north shouldn't hate the south and that we bring different energies together. I sometimes get really sick as an American of hearing us complain about ourselves. And then other people are like, why do you have no pride? Why do you beat yourselves up so much? All our countries are like racist and sexist and homophobic. Like, this is not unique to your culture. Like, you think this is unique and you think you're so much worse, but you're not. And you should actually be nicer to yourselves because that would buoy and help some of you. So that was like really interesting to me to constantly be told that every day for 10 years by visiting foreigners. I'm really seeing what they're talking about, which is you have to appreciate the East and the West, the North and the South. You have to appreciate these different forces of energy that you don't like. They don't make you comfortable for a reason, but that's because there's a lot of diversity among humans and it's not an ethnic or racial or sexual line. It's really not. But there is like differences. All El Salvadorians are not the same. And like all Americans are not the same. So, but you'll find an El Salvadorian who's very similar to an American. And that's the beauty, I think, of what I'm talking about. So I remember them talking about North South a lot, and then they pass around this disgusting tobacco thing that you're supposed to snort and then spit out. But they keep explaining why. They're like, you have a pineal gland, you need to clear out the pineal gland. That's your third eye. If you don't clean it out, then you're going to have a different experience and it won't be good. So they pass around the cup and they give you the first one. And then they say, in an hour, we'll offer a second one if you like. And then in 2 more hours, we'll offer a third and final one if you want. And I just remember thinking, I'm sure one is enough. And so I took the first one and so did everyone. And then I start hearing moaning and weird things. And you can tell when people are shifting into it. I was in the mountains in Ecuador, so it's a freezing cold. So we have like three wool out blankets on us. And, I'm wearing a hoodie and a vest and a thing over my head and no flashlights, but you can have notepads and stuff. And luckily, from years of being an author, I can write notes without a light and just make sense of them. So I had a notepad and a pen. And I started feeling it come on, and then I felt very nervous, and everyone else is puking in buckets and making all this noise. And I'm just sitting there, okay, this is not good. If this gets any worse, it's going to be really bad. And they had people offering to help you, and I was like, no, thank you. But it was very nice, is what I'm trying to say. They really tried to make you feel comfortable. And I did see this happen to someone. If you get way too much, you're just freaking out. They take you to a separate area with a bigger bed. There's nothing they can give you. There's not an antidote, but they do their best to have that. And I remember thinking, that's all I need. I just need to know that if I start screaming, someone's going to be there. But here's the good news. None of that happened to me. I really did just have this like direct transcendent experience that was unlike anything else I've ever done before or since, but also so freakingly normal that it's hard to explain. I almost felt like everything I've been doing for 35, I think I was 35 when I did it. I'm 43 now. Everything I've been doing for 35 years is the opposite of everything I should be doing. Like this is more natural, the state that I'm in. And then I don't like hallucinations. I've just never been a fan of them. So I remembered on acid once, like these hallucinations started scaring me, and I remembered asking them to leave. So this is what I mentioned earlier. I just asked them to stop, and they did. So I hear people say it's a hallucinogen. I don't believe that at all. For me, it's like an injection that prevents your ego from dominating the conversation. That's one way I could describe it, maybe. So normally, like you finish a podcast and then one voice says that was fun, and then there's another voice, no it wasn't, and no one's going to watch it. And not only is no one going to watch it, but if someone does, they're going to troll you and they're going to write like really bad things, and that like feeling on the inside of your lip, oh, that was visible, everyone could see it. Just that's like the worst side of your mind. And so I would say ayahuasca, like that lessens, but you can still observe it, which is really cool. And so after years and years of meditation, I would say that meditation is where you're aware of that voice but you're not observing it. Ayahuasca, you're aware of it and observing it. So it's not at all like transcending in meditation, which I believe they call it like delta state or something. But it's a new state that I have not been in. But here's the interesting thing: I can get back to that state now pretty easily, but also I can't get there like the freakishly fun way that ayahuasca do. So I see why some people get addicted to ayahuasca and why they keep going back. It's just because it's like, do you want to paddle across a lake or do you want to get in like a steamboat and just have it take you to the other side? But I do believe that's a shortcut. I don't think you do the hard work, because when you come back to reality, you need to be better at this and you need to like keep doing it. So the first trip was very intense, very interesting, and I definitely ended up taking all three servings, and there were only three other people who took all three. But the reason I did it is because it wasn't like a drug to me. It wasn't a menace. It was actually opening something in me. You said it earlier, and I completely agree, but I would not have agreed with you before I did ayahuasca. We are interdimensional beings. We are in an interdimensional something. There are dimensions. And the reason I use that word is because that has to do with Einstein and time and stuff. Like time is definitely not working the way we perceive it here. Ayahuasca proved that to me like beyond any doubt. Time is a perception based thing that makes us feel like urgency and drives us. And I'm sure there's a huge purpose to it, but it's like fake in like the weirdest way ever. And I do believe this ties into every woo woo thing people hear about it. Like, as annoying as an Instagram person is who's talking about The Secret, they're talking about this. If you read these books, they all say the same thing. And it wasn't until after I did ayahuasca that I appreciated it. The reason you picture the success already is because the success already did come. There's no order to causality. You just think there is. But if you feel bliss in a moment, you're just feeling bliss in that moment. That's why people say this is the only moment. It's because it's actually true. But that moment before was real too. So, and that's why if you harbor resentment against previous moments, you're just making the new moment a repeat of that moment. And if you're living in a future moment, you're just not in this moment living with the future. So there's no wrong way to go through life, but it starts to become very clear when you're on ayahuasca that, yeah, there's a clock running. Like you drank the ayahuasca, it's been 15 minutes. Like you're aware of that, but you're also like in this timeless spot. And this is where I'm going to get into what ayahuasca did for me. So it is a jumble, all three trips to me at this point. It is impossible for me to tell you which night was which one. I don't even remember the biggest thing I learned on the whole thing that is about my son, which night it was. I honestly don't. I think it was the last one just because it would make the most sense for like how it fell out. But for me, a lot of ayahuasca is crying. And the reason why a lot of it is crying is because I was raised culturally, not by my parents. I have to stress this, to not show or experience emotions. I don't know why, but I think I just watched a lot of TV and like just that 80s mentality, because I was like very little in the 80s. And I just think there was still this machismo thing. Boys don't cry. The sissy boys don't, girls don't talk to them. Like the big guy who like pushes the nerd out of the way. Not that you want to be that guy, but you don't want to be the nerd either. Like that would be the best way for me to explain it. So being a very emotional person, like I'm a very sensitive, I like did a great job of masking that and covering that and like just not experiencing emotions. So a, a lot of my ayahuasca time is just crying because my body and my brain are like, dude, we need to do this. Like, it has been like years. If you had just cried a little those few times, you wouldn't have to do this now. And then a lot of the crying too was free crying. And this is what I'm getting into about time. And it was because with all certainty in the universe, I just got this message on one of the three times I did it. And it said, before you ever came to Earth, you agreed to something with something else. That something else is now your son. And the agreement is that your son didn't want to grow up with his dad. He wanted to have a tough life without his biological dad. And that's between him and him. But you are the kind of person who made the agreement to do that. And this is where it gets preachy and weird if I say it a certain way. So it did not say it this way, but I say it this way. So let me just repeat that for anyone listening. At no point did ayahuasca say this to me, but I interpret what I learned and then I can put it out there. So I am not saying this is true or false. I'm saying I believe this is true. If you were the victim as a child of something really bad, you wanted it and chose it before you came here. And the person who did it probably reluctantly but lovingly agreed to do it. And that sounds weird and it sounds like I'm forgiving horrible people and blaming the good people. I don't care because it's just what occurred on it is it said your son is going to do this to you and you agreed to it so he's not doing it to you, but no matter what you do and no matter what you try, your son will be separate from you for at least 5 years but probably longer. And this is the part that was the most painful. The more you try to prevent it, the worse it gets. So I'm going to come back to what ayahuasca taught me because there's a second thing that is huge, but I want to finish this part of the story because I brought it up at the beginning. So I came home from Ecuador. My son was supposed to arrive with his mother 3 nights after. It was a Friday night. And I went out to dinner with my dad because he was so excited to hear about ayahuasca. He was like, he never did it, but he was like, dude, I want to, you went to Ecuador? You did what? I don't even know what ayahuasca is. So I told him like everything. And I said, look, I got to be honest with you. I got this message that I should give my son to his mom. And so here's what I'm thinking I'm going to do. I'm going to just say, okay, you can officially take him back to Thailand and raise him there. You just have to send him to America every summer for 3 months. And I want 2 to 3 weeks in the winter. And then I want the ability to visit whenever I feel like it. And I didn't do that with the glee of a dad who wants to be a part-time dad. I did it with the most least amount of joy and suffering ever. That has never been my goal or intention in life. I asked my wife to have kids. She had never even thought about having kids. I'm not saying this to like a jury. I'm just explaining my thought process. Like to me, having children was always everything. It was always like, I want this career and I want children. And if I ever have to choose kids, no question. Like, so my dad was like, actually, in a weird way, I think that's nice and generous and probably the best way to go through this because I think it's going to be almost impossible for his mother to get along without someone else earning income and stuff with her. I just don't think she's wired to be like an American single mom. She was raised in a country where that is not at all how it works. She has no model for that. She's plenty smart. She speaks English like a pro. I mean, it's not like anything like that, but it's just a cultural difference. So he said, but why don't you just wait until he's 5? Like he's 2 right now. Why don't you just agree to do that when he's entering kindergarten? Let him like keep this schedule for the next 2, 3 years. She can do that. You can do that. And I was like, it's not a bad idea. So he's like, and I wouldn't tell her now. I would just wait because if you tell her now, based on everything we know about her, she's just going to ask for it tomorrow. Like once you say you're going to agree to this, she's not going to wait because that was part of the divorce was she had agreed to wait till 2019 to move to Thailand. And then starting in 2014, she said, every day of my life, why aren't we moving yet? You're holding me hostage in America, essentially. That was like our over and over again fight. And I was like, no, you agreed to let us live here for 6 more years. I have a career and I want to say goodbye to my family and friends. And I'm not trying to throw my personal business out. I'm just trying to explain the dynamics and what was going on in my head. So I agreed with my dad and I said, that's a great idea. And then 3 days later, I get an email the night my son's flight is supposed to arrive from my ex-wife, which is strange because we text and FaceTime and call normally. And it says, I fell down the stairs and hurt my back, and the doctor forbid me from flying home. I have to wait a few days and then I can bring him home. So I immediately said, oh my God, that's terrible. Tell you what, I'll just fly over there, pick him up, come home, and you can stay there as long as you need. I'll watch him. Because in our custody agreement, that was fine. It's not like illegal. So I buy the ticket anyway. I'm just like, I have a plane ticket. I'm coming out there. This is weird. Like, you were supposed to come home legally 2 days ago. And then I don't even hear back. And I call her dad and he's, oh, I'll call you right back. And then he doesn't call me back. And I'm like, okay, something has gone terribly wrong. Then I get an email from her, but it's from her parents and it's written to my parents and not me. And it just says, for the benefit of everyone involved, we've decided to keep, I'm keeping my son's name out of this. But they used his name, just to be clear. We've decided to keep in Thailand with his mom. This is the best solution for everyone. You're off the hook. You don't have to do anything. Well, that's not true at all because I have child support payments that I have to pay in America, and there's no way to get out of those. So I'm still paying child support, even though my ex has abducted my son. I called the State Department. They were very nice, but they basically said, you're screwed. They told me you can try. So I tried. I spent my entire life savings trying my hardest to get my son back. And all it did was make it worse. And while I had the case open, they had to play nice. So I was able to see my son every single day virtually on Skype apps and stuff until he was 5. And then they promised after I dropped the lawsuit, because I decided to try a different tactic, that they would call regularly and work our way up to visits. But instead, they've done the opposite and they've just completely, like, I send him checks and cards and stuff like all the time and they don't even respond anymore. I don't know what's going on, so I can't like truly blame anyone, but I do know that this goes back to ayahuasca. When I check in, my word for just like dropping my ego, I just keep getting, the end of this is great. You know that this ends wonderfully. He loves you. He's at your side on your deathbed. He's your son and he appreciates and respects you, and you just have to keep a clean record. I'm very careful on these podcasts to always say that I did not work things out with his mother, but I wish her no ill. I wish her parents no ill. I still have a lot of resentment and anger issues that bubble up because missing my son every day sucks and I would like to be treated like a human. But I also understand that these are different people from a different culture and just life works the way it does. And maybe someday they'll find their version of God and forgive me. And maybe they'll, in addition to forgiving me, tell me that, but I would never know. So going back to ayahuasca, what it taught me very specifically, and then I can get into details, is you are connected to every single thing you need to be connected to. I maybe everything, but I'm only going to say need to be. And that especially includes friendships and relationships. And we're here. It didn't tell me why we're here in a universal sense, but it told me why I'm here. So it was more direct because, again, it wouldn't matter to me. What would matter to me is helping you learn why you're here or helping you do what you want to do while you're here. So really, ayahuasca taught me that we're creatures of love and we're supposed to work through immense conflict and show love over and over again. So that's why it's like hard when I agree to come on a podcast and talk about this. I know that on one level, it might be very hard for my son to see this or hear about it. And I also know that if I'm not careful in how I talk about it, I'm doing the opposite. I'm not being in love. I'm telling a narrative that makes me look good and someone else look bad. And I'm asking for compassion and pity. It's okay to want compassion and it's great to receive compassion, but I should not be using anger, resentment, or other feelings to heal that. So while I was on it, what I was able to do very specifically is if I shut my eyes and pictured any person I know, I could see their spine. And the spine would either be gleaming white, the purest, just cleanest looking white spine you could imagine. Picture a tooth that's really white. That's how I would say it. All the way to, I never saw it this dark, but to black, like to completely, not even black, like the absence of all color, just nothing. So and what would happen is I'd check in, and some of my friends' spines were like a gray. That's like the level to which like no one I knew was way over. And it was gray because they were down, because they weren't experiencing the joy of life and they were like letting anger specifically bother them. So really it was like all about anger. It wasn't about sadness or anxiety as much as it was about anger. I think what I learned from this is everyone has a go-to emotion, crying or whatever, but the one that stings us the most is anger. So when you're like sad and crying, you're actually like above anger. And then below anger is giving up. And so when I was seeing these spines that weren't healthy, they were between anger and giving up. And then the healthy spines were above anger and on the way to enjoying everything. And the color of your spine will shift as you go through life because a trauma will hit you. Like my ex-wife didn't return to America with my son. Like I'm sure my spine was like a wicked gray for a long time because of that. And so what I did is I wrote down all these names of people whose spines I was looking at, and then I vowed to write them emails and check in on them. Some of the spines were white, and it just said, make sure you let this person know that you're going to be there for them their whole life. It was really simple. This other friend, I remember this one really specifically. Remember, this is 2017, and I got them. It was really specific. It said, Your friend is losing his mind over Trump being president. It is destroying his life and everything. He's a family man and it's taking out his ability to be nice to his kids. You need to tell him to stop. It wasn't like you should tell him you love him. It was like really, so I wrote him an email and I said, hey, dude, we're old friends. I'm just going to be honest. I went to Ecuador. I took ayahuasca. It told me that you're very angry about politics and that I should tell you to stop. I know that this is weird. You know I'm weird. Who cares? I love you. I hope all's well. Please let me know if this is just completely off base. He wrote me back and said, it's like you were spying in my house 2 nights ago. My wife literally threatened to get a divorce if I don't stop reading the newspaper and getting angry about Trump. I had four of those kind of responses to the point where I'm like, okay, and then I came home and I wrote my fifth novel, Ardor, is about psychics because I started becoming obsessed with what is a psychic.
There's so many things I want to say related to everything that you're talking about, but just to make sure that the listeners understand. So, while on ayahuasca, you develop this ability to be able to see the spines of some of your loved ones, right? Friends, family. And if they had a white, pristine spine, they were in harmony in terms of their emotions. And if they had a gray spine, because it could go all the way black, but most people were probably gray. They were dealing with some sort of anger. And it's interesting that you bring that up because I literally just spoke to someone on the podcast. Her name is Katish Haberfield, and she works in the realm of spirit releasement therapy. And we talked about different sort of entity attachments that people have stuck to them that they don't even realize. And one of those entity attachments we talked about in the terms of like thought forms, negative thought forms. So I had asked her, I was like, a lot of times we can probably meditate and find ways to get back into balance, but a lot of times people really struggle to let go of a lot of their emotions, right? A lot of these negative thought forms. So I asked her, I was like, what is the emotion that provokes a lot of these thought forms that people walk around with like these dark clouds over their head that really affect their lives? And she said the number one is, well, there's two, fear and anger. Those are the
Yeah,
two
totally.
most like intense emotions that people struggle with and that keep them really stuck in their life. So it's interesting that you're bringing up the anger piece because that's one of the most powerful emotions that she talked about. So I just wanted to really highlight that because I thought that was extremely fascinating.
No, that's really cool. And you summed it up also really well. And I'll actually going to remember your phrasing because I like that. And it's like it's balance. You nailed it. Like it's how balanced are you? And that's why I would say like a white spine doesn't mean the person doesn't smoke cigarettes or doesn't have family problems. It just means that they're coping and dealing with it correctly.
You know, you said something interesting when it came to like the aspect of like soul contracts, right? And the contract that
Yeah.
you and your son made. And that's a concept that I think a lot of people struggle with, this idea that we choose the life that we are experiencing, because a lot of times some people might be experiencing heaven on earth and other times people might be experiencing hell on earth, right? So the concept of trying to figure out like why would I choose this for myself, and that also makes me think about this whole notion of life and purpose and how we look at that. So I guess I say all of that to say, after going through that experience and digesting it for all of these different years and continuing to process it, where do you fall on why we're here, right? Because people talk about purpose a lot. What's my purpose? What am I supposed to give back to the world? I just want to hear from you in general what you think purpose is and if you think we should look at it differently.
Yes, I think we should look at it differently. And yes, I have an answer to that. But my answer is like so vague and annoying that even I'm annoyed by it. This is school, and you definitely signed up for it, but no way in hell do you know what the course title is or what the final exam is. You don't know
Mm,
anything. There's no syllabus. You just have a vague recollection that you signed up. And this specifically applies to suicide. I don't think there's a punishment for doing that, but the people who try and fail, and I'm not talking about people who fake try because there is such a thing and that's not the same. I'm talking like ND, near death experience people who like literally there's cases where someone jumps off a bridge and they somehow survive. They all say the same thing. They say with the second it was too late to take it back, I was full of regret. The second, every single one of them, none of them are like, and some of them still go back and try to commit suicide again because that has nothing to do with what I'm talking about. But just like that knowledge, I am sure of it. So no matter how bad things are getting, your son is gone, you like whatever, just know that is an option. It's on the table. People take it. but it is not the option that gets you out of here permanently. You will just come back. So that's what I think the purpose of life is unknown on purpose. And if you knew it, it wouldn't be fun or challenging or educational. But it's school for sure. I do have like vast patches of life where things go great and I'm very happy. And there's not a coincidence to that. It's my mindset. So the happiest I've ever been is after my son was abducted because it was learning to live with that knowledge and then still make friendships and meet my wife and have two more children. It's hard to explain this because I can't trade my two daughters and my wife to get my son back, but I would also never trade my son to get this, and I don't have to. But what I have to learn and what I have learned is how to love my life with its completeness. And part of the completeness is the missing of the son. That's part of my journey.
That's the biggest thing. Okay, so I think it's important to talk about your podcast, right? Because
Sure.
with your experience with ayahuasca and your understanding, your deeper understanding about relationships, why we're here, life in general, how does death tie into all of that? Where did your fascination with death come into play? Because obviously the podcast it's called Coffin Talk, and a lot of what you focus on is death and how that relates to how we live our lives.
So there's two threads to the story that are pretty quick. One is when I was very impressionable as a child, my grandmother on my mother's side had Alzheimer's, and I knew her before the symptoms became super obvious. And then I saw them wreak havoc on her, and then she died when I was about 10. It was very traumatic for me to be on the phone the last time ever with my grandma and have her not only not know who I was, but not even know what the word California meant because I was like, it's your grandson in California. But it also put this like permanent thing in my head where I just accepted death at an early age. Like I understood it somehow. Because I remember not like being sad that she died. I remember being sad that she wasn't herself at the end. That was where the sadness came in. And then the second time I dealt with death was in sixth grade when I was 11. One of my best friends, his mom fell off a bike and her arm wouldn't get better. So she went to a doctor and they found out she had a brain tumor and she proceeded to rapidly succumb to it and die. And for some reason, I not only felt comfortable, but was asking my mom regularly to go to her house with her and keep her company and talk to her. And I got to know my friend's mom as she died, and no one understood what was going on, but everyone also understood that I was calming her a lot and it was like helpful to her. Then my mom's friend, who I didn't even know, got cancer, and I would visit her and help her. So I just have this really soft, deep thing in me that not only is calm around people who are dying, but I like helping them. So I think the same way you have like doulas who like usher life into the world, I think I'm like a death helper, and I don't think I'm alone. There's like forums on Facebook of hospice workers and stuff. So after the divorce, I had always volunteered before I had a family, and the reason I stopped was because I was too busy. I had my son. So I immediately signed up to volunteer at Hospice of the Valley here in Phoenix, which is the oldest, second oldest hospice system in the world, and I think the oldest in America. I might be wrong, it might be third, but the point is, it's like historically famous because Phoenix is a dry place, so it's considered like good for like people with tuberculosis and stuff. And so I started doing hospice work, and I decided to do it in the dementia ward because I remembered my grandma and I wanted to help end of life. And so it was like it was 3.5, 4 years. It stopped when COVID came because they wouldn't allow volunteers and because it's a lot of older people, obviously. And what I noticed was it wasn't hard for the people dying. It was always hard for the people who were losing someone. We have an obsession in America with youth and with telling you hold on to your youth and whatever you don't die. And then when someone dies, or like when we have a tragedy in New Orleans a couple weeks ago, or when this airs, I don't know. It's we need a moment of silence to observe the horrible atrocity. But there's no actual talking about death. No one's like, and these people died and their family is missing them. And that's the thing that I like really learned from hospice is like people just don't talk about death. And then they're like, oh my God, what do I do? I'm so guilty. I never told you how much I loved you. Or the other thing was on the dying side, just every single person who was unhappy dying, who could talk, who could articulate, was like, I wish I'd worked less. Like every single one of them. So I decided with my wife to start a podcast called Coffin Talk, which is where I interview people. And the point is, I just ask everyone at some point in the interview, what do you think happens when you die? And I do it for two reasons. One, everyone should think about that like a lot. You should think about what do you think happens when you die? Not is it painful or what are you dying from? Not at all. I'm talking about do you think your consciousness will end? Do you think you will continue? Do you think you're being judged? Do you like how does your view on what happened after this affect what you're doing now? And what I found is that atheists don't think I can still murder. They find an intrinsic reason to like not murder. And then I've also found that super Christians don't just not murder because they're afraid of hell. They have a much more different balanced altruistic reason for it, and yet they're also Christians. And so it's like interesting, like what I've learned from now we're on episode 212, I think I recorded yesterday. So I've interviewed hundreds of people, and not just for the podcast. If you include like my experience in hospice, I would say over 1,000. And everyone has a completely different answer, and everyone has the same answer. It's like interesting. Definitely the biggest theme ever by far is we're all energy and that it has to go somewhere. Energy doesn't end. So that would be the thing I would say almost everyone agrees with. And then the other thing almost everyone agrees with, and again, I always have to leave like the little door open, is it does feel profound. There are moments in this experience that feel profound. They feel beyond explanation. They feel beyond science textbooks, and they either give me hope and inspire me, or they terrify me, but in a good way. I don't remember which episode number it is, but it's in the early era. His name is Christian Sundberg, and I strongly recommend when people want to listen to the show, I say if you're gonna listen to become a fan of the show, start anywhere. If you just want to listen to one and never listen to it again, this is the most interesting out of all 200 to this day. And the reason why is he claims to have prenatal memories. He was in China as a foreign exchange student, and he had some horrible physical ailment, and he was in a Chinese hospital, unable to speak really and unable to contact his family for months in writhing horrible pain. And when he came out of it, he suddenly remembered his life before being Christian, and he tells it in a robotic way that is either he memorized a script and is completely lying, or it's just boring and he doesn't want to say it anymore. And I read his book, and his book is free, which makes no sense. Usually when you're selling something, there's skepticism. He's not selling anything. He also just, his only motivation is I just want to help other people who feel like quitting because you can't, like there's no way out of this. And so he gets into, he said his first life he was in the womb, and then he was so terrified of coming back that he ejected. And then he felt so bad when he saw how much it hurt the mom and dad, how much they cried about the miscarriage from their end. And so he said he vowed to come back and not do that again. But then even in this life, he still feels the compulsion to go back, but he remembers what it was like.
I look forward to diving deep into that episode that you just mentioned.
I'm just going to look him up to give the episode number.
Okay, that would be perfect for the listeners.
Yeah, number 54. So if you look up Coffin Talk, Mike Oppenheim, my name, and then episode 54, you should be able to find it. It's Christian Sundberg. You are not human is the name of the episode, which was his quote.
Thank you for sharing all of that. So, again, this has been such a great conversation, and I would love to ask you if you shifted in perspective on anything recently since the show is called Shifting Dimensions, and if you can share that, and then after that, share where people can find you outside of Coffin Talk if they want to learn more about your work.
Sure. The thing I've shifted the most in, and I'm actually like afraid to say this on the internet because it's so unpopular, is guess what? Every single person that you hate has every right to be doing what they're doing, and that you should give them that. And the harder you push back against the things you don't like, the more they will come into your life. Whether they come from a different direction, it does not matter. Pushing back against what you resent is the point. So, like, my shifting dimension has been, and it's why I alluded to politics earlier, is I used to be political when I was young, and then I was not political for 15, 20 years on purpose. And then when I watched a lot of Americans succumb to what I used to go through in my teens and early 20s, which is blaming and resenting and getting angry, it was very traumatizing for me because I'm not right or wrong. I just know that like the path to peace is never unpeaceful. So no matter how much you like hate someone or a group or some thought out there, work hard on your relationship to that, because that's what's shifted for me. What has shifted the most for me in my life, and especially because of ayahuasca and all the stuff, is you really don't know why someone is walking in their shoes the way they are. It doesn't matter if you walk in their shoes. Like the famous proverb to me is a little off. It's not don't judge someone until you've walked in their shoes. It's like even if you walked in their shoes, don't judge them. Like you just, there's just like a different motivation and purpose. But also, if you look at it, things just seem to work out. And that's true even with like fathers who have their children abducted, mothers who make the decision to abduct their son, mass murderers, the victims of mass murderers, all of these awful things. So sometimes I sometimes really think this. Maybe we should have the most compassion for the people who are the biggest villains. They're like they're actually in a weird way like stepping up to the plate. Like I thought about this a lot because I'm Jewish, so I'm allowed to talk about the Holocaust freely. So I use this example. Maybe Hitler was helping the world see what hate looks like when hate is unbridled and without any like checks. And maybe the reason we haven't had World War III yet is because millions of people saw that and were actually triggered by it to the point where they lessened how hard they're going to fight. So maybe ultimately, if we ever get world peace, people will say, well, what really triggered world peace was the Holocaust. It was that Hitler guy. There's a very weird way to look at it. Or sometimes you'll look at someone's autobiography and you'll be like, wow, if their parents didn't beat them and lock them in a box, they never would have been resilient. And then they wouldn't have. So through great challenges and great adversity comes greatness, comes great people. Like heroism usually is in the face of conflict. So instead of looking at conflict, what I have shifted is I now see conflict as a scary but real opportunity for me. And I'm trying to step into it as often as possible. There's still days where I'm just exhausted and scared of conflict and I retreat. And you know what? That's okay too.
Thank you so much for sharing that perspective. Where can people find you if they want to learn more about other types of work that you do outside of your podcast?
Yeah, my favorite thing that I do in life is I run a little Substack, and on the Substack is a weekly essay that I write. Sometimes it's fiction, and also a link to the podcast. So I'll email you once a week, and it's www.mikeop.com.
Thank you so much for stopping by the show. I'm going to leave a link to your website in the show notes.
Thank you.